Chicago, 1937. Snow fell gently over the city, but behind the glow of street lamps and the hum of jazz clubs, something far darker was about to unfold. Charles Ross, a devoted husband, a respected businessman, stepped into his car for what should have been an ordinary drive. He never came back. Hours later, a chilling ransom note arrived, and what followed would spiral into one of the most haunting kidnappings Chicago had ever seen. But the true horror? It wasn't just who took him, it was why. Chicago, 1937. The air was sharp with winter frost, the kind that bites at the skin and lingers in the lungs. A city alive with jazz clubs, bootleggers, and the quiet hum of a world still climbing out of the Great Depression. But for one family, a quiet December evening would spiral into a nightmare that would grip the nation. Charles Ross, a well-liked greeting card executive, walked out of his home for what should have been an ordinary drive. He never returned. What followed was one of the most chilling kidnappings in Chicago's history. An investigation riddled with ransom notes, false leads, and a truth so disturbing it still echoes today. The twist? The person responsible wasn't who anyone suspected. And when the truth came to light, it shook not only Chicago, but the very foundations of how America viewed crime, money, and trust. Charles Ross was not a man anyone expected to vanish. At 67, he was the president of the Chicago-based Ross Greeting Card Company, a small but respected business built on his vision. Friends described him as soft-spoken, courteous, with a dry humor that made strangers feel like old companions. His neatly combed silver hair and rimless glasses gave him the appearance of a kindly professor. At home, he was devoted to his wife, Clara, and their children. The Rosses lived in a comfortable house in Evanston, just north of the city, a neighborhood of sturdy brick homes, snow-covered lawns, and the muffled crunch of tires on icy streets. The house smelled of Clara's cinnamon bread that evening, and the faint hiss of the radiator filled the rooms with warmth. But under the stillness of that December night, someone was watching. It began with a phone call. At 6:30 p.m., Clara answered the ringing telephone. A gruff voice told her Charles had been taken, and if she wanted him back alive, she needed to pay $50,000 in ransom, a staggering sum in 1937, equal to nearly $1 million today. Clara's hand trembled as she clutched the receiver. "Who is this? Where is my husband?" The caller hung up. On Charles's desk upstairs, a handwritten note lay waiting. It demanded the ransom be delivered discreetly, with instructions that seemed oddly precise. The police would later confirm what Clara already knew: Charles had been kidnapped. The first conflict came when the FBI arrived. Their presence was immediate. Hoover's men had been chasing kidnappers ever since the Linebaugh baby case in 1932, and they were determined not to fail again. Agents in dark coats crowded the Ross home, their voices low but urgent. Clara, overwhelmed, clung to the hope that Charles was still alive. But the ransom instructions were peculiar. The kidnappers demanded Clara wait for another call with further directions. They warned her not to involve law enforcement, yet their demands kept changing. Times, locations, even the manner of payment. It was as if they wanted to confuse her or stall for time. Neighbors whispered. Some believed Charles must have enemies in the greeting card business. Others suspected organized crime, which still ran rampant through Chicago. But the FBI quickly learned there was no mob connection. Instead, the clues pointed closer to home. The second conflict arose when the ransom notes continued to arrive, each one more chilling than the last. "We are watching you," one read in spidery handwriting. Another demanded Clara keep her shades drawn at night. The implication was clear: someone was stalking her. The third conflict: Charles's car was found abandoned in a quiet alley. The driver's seat was pulled back as if someone taller had been behind the wheel. A single glove was left on the passenger side, and there were no fingerprints. There were subtle signs investigators noticed, though they couldn't piece them together yet. The ransom notes, for instance, were written on cheap stationery, the kind a man like Charles would never buy, but one that might have been picked up by someone desperate, someone close. Witnesses recalled seeing a man near the Ross home in the days before the abduction, but his description kept changing. Sometimes tall, sometimes short, sometimes with a mustache. Almost as though people were describing someone they thought they knew but couldn't quite place. And there was the tone of the calls. Clara told agents the voice on the other end seemed familiar, like an echo of someone she'd spoken to before. Weeks into the ordeal, the FBI made a grim discovery. In a drainage ditch near a rural road outside Chicago, they found Charles Ross's body. He had been dead for days. The nation reeled. This was no longer a kidnapping. It was murder. The ransom calls continued, even after Charles's death. Clara, devastated, realized with horror that the men tormenting her never intended to return her husband. They were playing a cruel game, extorting money even as his body lay in the cold ground. That was when suspicion began to fall on someone no one expected. The investigation eventually led to a man named Fred Killer Burke, a gangster tied loosely to Chicago's criminal underworld. But he wasn't the mastermind. The true shock came when the FBI connected the ransom notes to someone in Charles's own orbit, an associate who knew the Ross family's routines, finances, and vulnerabilities. The handwriting matched. The voice on the phone aligned. It wasn't an anonymous mobster. It was a trusted acquaintance, someone who had smiled at the Ross family, shared meals with them, even sat in their living room. Betrayal cut deeper than any ransom demand. The confrontation came in a dimly lit interrogation room. The suspect sat with his hands clasped tightly, sweat beading on his forehead. Across from him, an FBI agent slammed the ransom notes onto the table. "You think Clara didn't recognize your voice? You think we wouldn't match the paper you used?" The man's eyes flickered, then hardened. She was never supposed to know. Charles wasn't supposed to die, the agent snapped. Silence. Then, in a low voice, the man muttered, "He knew too much." The room chilled. For the first time, the agents realized this wasn't about money alone. There was something Charles had discovered, something dangerous enough to kill for. The suspect was charged. The newspapers splashed the Ross kidnapping across front pages, and the FBI claimed another victory in their war against kidnappers. Yet, for Clara, there was no real resolution. She buried her husband in the frozen earth of Evanston, the scent of pine and cold stone heavy in the air. Friends gathered, but whispers persisted. What had Charles known? Why had his own acquaintance turned on him with such cruelty? The trial offered answers, but not the whole truth. And here lies the haunting part of the story. The Charles Ross kidnapping was never just about ransom. It was about betrayal, silence, and secrets buried beneath Chicago's snow. Because as the trial unfolded, a shocking new lead emerged, suggesting Charles's murder was only the beginning. The funeral of Charles Ross should have been the end. A grieving widow, a city on edge, a suspect already behind bars. But as mourners lowered his casket into the frozen ground, another story was already stirring beneath the surface. A darker story, one that threatened to unravel not just a family, but an entire network of crime, power, and betrayal. Because Charles hadn't simply been the victim of a greedy acquaintance. He had stumbled onto something larger, something that someone was willing to kill to protect. And the truth, when it came out, would be even more disturbing than his abduction. The suspect in custody, a man Charles had once trusted, sat in silence as newspapers branded him a monster. The FBI paraded the case as solved, yet not everyone was convinced. Clara Ross, still dressed in black, told reporters outside her home. "I want the truth, not a half-truth. My husband deserves that." Agents inside the bureau weren't satisfied either. The evidence pointed to the acquaintance. Yes, but there were gaps. Too many. The ransom calls after Charles S. death. The handwriting inconsistencies between certain notes. The eerie mention during interrogation. He knew too much. It didn't feel like the end. It felt like the beginning. Chicago in early 1938 was a city layered with contradictions. Snow blanketed its boulevards, while smoke from steel mills hung heavy in the air. Jazz still poured from South Side clubs, but corruption pulsed through City Hall. The FBI had been waging war on gangsters for nearly a decade, but even with Capone locked away, the underworld thrived. Gambling, bootlegging, extortion. It all still ran beneath the surface like a second city hidden under the streets. And now whispers suggested Charles Ross had uncovered one of those secrets. Agents searching Charles S. office found a small, leather-bound ledger tucked behind the bookshelves. Inside were neat, cryptic entries, names, dates, and dollar amounts. At first glance, it looked like company records. But one detail stood out. The names weren't suppliers or clients. They were politicians. Clara recalled something chilling. Days before his disappearance, Charles had been unusually tense at dinner. He had leaned in, lowered his voice, and told her, "If something ever happens to me, don't trust the obvious answer. Look deeper." She hadn't understood at the time. Now, his words felt like a warning. A neighbor came forward claiming to have seen a tall man in a fedora lingering near the Ross home 2 nights before the abduction. The description didn't match the acquaintance in custody. When shown mugshots of known Chicago mobsters, the neighbor pointed at one. It was someone the FBI knew well. Agents noticed that several names in Charles S. hidden ledger had already appeared in other FBI investigations, cases involving bribery and union racketeering. The amounts listed next to those names weren't small. Tens of thousands of dollars. Charles, a greeting card executive, should have had no reason to keep such records, unless he had stumbled onto something he was never meant to see. The word insurance was scribbled in the margins of one page. Insurance against what? Or against whom? The bombshell dropped when forensic analysts revealed the ransom notes weren't written by just one hand. They were written by 2. That meant the acquaintance in custody hadn't acted alone. He had help. And one of those handwriting samples matched the mobster the neighbor had identified. Suddenly the case exploded in scale. This wasn't a lone betrayal. This was a conspiracy. The FBI pieced together the truth. Charles Ross had accidentally come across a financial trail connecting Chicago politicians to organized crime payoffs. His company, small as it was, had handled printing orders and invoices that revealed too much. Someone panicked. Someone in both business and politics. The acquaintance, desperate for money and pressured by darker forces, was recruited to set up Charles. The mob provided muscle, intimidation, and the means to carry out the abduction. The reveal shattered Clara. Her husband hadn't died because of random greed. He had died because he knew the wrong secret. The next confrontation came in a dim, smoky Chicago courtroom. The acquaintance sat hunched, his lawyer whispering furiously in his ear. Across the aisle, federal prosecutors presented the ledger, the notes, and the damning testimony of neighbors. The man broke. In a trembling voice, he admitted the mob's involvement. He confessed to luring Charles out of the house that night, but swore he hadn't meant for him to die. They promised it was just to scare him, just to keep him quiet. But once he was gone, they said it was too late. He had to disappear. The courtroom gasped, but the names he mentioned, the men who had ordered it, were not in the dock. They were powerful, protected. The acquaintance was convicted. Justice, on paper, was served, but the truth still felt unfinished. Clara sat in the courtroom, silent, her gloved hands clenched in her lap. She knew the men truly responsible were still free, still pulling strings in smoke-filled rooms. The FBI launched quiet investigations into those names in the ledger. Some would face charges later, but many would slip through cracks, shielded by money and influence. Charles' death had exposed a sliver of the underworld, but behind that sliver stretched an entire labyrinth. And just when it seemed the case was finally winding down, Clara Ross received an anonymous letter in the mail. It contained only 6 words. "Your husband died for the truth." Beneath it was a single initial, scrawled in ink. An initial that matched one of the most powerful political figures in Chicago. The FBI knew what it meant. The Ross kidnapping wasn't over. It was only the first thread in a far bigger conspiracy. The anonymous letter was supposed to bring closure. Instead, it ripped open a deeper wound. "Your husband died for the truth." 6 words, 1 initial, and suddenly, Clara Ross realized the nightmare wasn't finished. Because if that letter was genuine, then Charles hadn't just been the victim of greed. He had been silenced for uncovering something far bigger, something powerful men were willing to kill for. And now, by receiving the letter, Clara had become a target too. The FBI wanted the letter immediately. Agents in long coats came to Clara's home, their voices low, their eyes darting toward the windows as though someone might be watching. They dusted the envelope for fingerprints, studied the handwriting, and locked it away. But the message left Clara shaken. The initial scrawled beneath the words belonged to a Chicago alderman, a man with decades of political influence. He wasn't just respected, he was untouchable. If he was involved in Charles' death, then the conspiracy stretched further than Clara could ever have imagined. Chicago in the spring of 1938 pulsed with contradictions. Tulips lined Michigan Avenue while, only blocks away, speakeasies still thrived in shadowed basements. The city smelled of thawing earth and coal smoke. Streetcars rattled by as newspaper boys shouted headlines about the Ross case, feeding a public hungry for answers. But behind the noise, the city's political machine churned relentlessly. Votes were bought, favors traded, and secrets buried deep. Clara now found herself staring at the heart of that machine, and wondering if she would survive it. One evening, Clara found a brick thrown through her parlor window. Wrapped around it was a scrap of newspaper with 2 words scrawled in black ink, "Stay quiet." She gasped as glass crunched under her shoes. Whoever had sent the letter wasn't bluffing. They were watching. When Clara pressed the FBI for answers, she met resistance. Agents whispered that the Bureau wanted to avoid a political firestorm. Hoover himself was wary of challenging Chicago's political machine without airtight evidence. Clara's frustration boiled. If the system wouldn't fight for Charles, she would. Late one night, a man approached Clara outside a church service. Nervous, shifting from foot to foot, he whispered, "Your husband had something. Something that could bring them all down. Find it, and you'll have the truth." Before she could ask more, he vanished into the crowd. Charles' hidden ledger suddenly seemed incomplete, as though it were only a fragment. Clara remembered how he had always kept meticulous files, locked drawers in his study, keys hidden in unlikely places. Could there be another record, another ledger he had never shown anyone? Her mind returned to his cryptic words at dinner before the kidnapping. "If something ever happens to me, look deeper." What if he had left her a trail? Rummaging through Charles' old desk one stormy night, Clara noticed the faint outline of a compartment beneath the bottom drawer. Heart pounding, she pried it open with a letter opener. Inside was a second ledger, older, with worn leather covers. But this one was different. It contained not only names and numbers, but meeting places, coded phrases, and even sketches of faces. And at the back, one page chilled her to the bone. It listed not just businessmen and politicians, but federal officials. Charles had stumbled onto corruption that reached beyond Chicago. The truth was clear now. Charles hadn't just been silenced by gangsters or a desperate acquaintance. He had uncovered a network of political graft, criminal payoffs, and law enforcement collusion. A network so vast it threatened to shake the foundations of Chicago's power structure. The anonymous letter hadn't been a threat. It had been a clue. Someone on the inside wanted her to know the truth. But by opening that hidden ledger, Clara realized she wasn't just a grieving widow anymore. She was now the keeper of the very secret her husband had died for. Clara carried the second ledger to the FBI. The agents' faces went pale as they flipped through its pages. One finally muttered, "This could topple half the city." But not everyone in that office was trustworthy. Clara noticed the way one agent slipped out early, the way his eyes lingered on the ledger before he left. That evening, she received another phone call, this time from a voice she didn't recognize. "Mrs. Ross, you have something that doesn't belong to you. Return it, or you'll end up like your husband." Her hands shook as the line went dead. The FBI tried to assure Clara they could protect her, but the sense of safety was gone. Neighbors began noticing strange cars idling outside her home. Letters slipped under her door carried no words, just crude sketches of coffins. Still, Clara refused to back down. For the first time, grief hardened into resolve. If Charles had died for the truth, then she would live for it. She began keeping her own notes, recording every detail, every suspicion, every name. And then, in late May, the breakthrough came. One of the coded phrases in Charles' ledger matched a secret location, a warehouse along the Chicago River. Clara told the FBI. A raid was planned. But on the eve of the operation, Clara's phone rang. This time, the voice wasn't threatening. It was urgent, almost pleading. "Don't trust the raid. They know. Someone inside the bureau tipped them off. If you go, you'll walk into an ambush." The line clicked dead. Clara's breath caught. For the first time, she realized the conspiracy wasn't just in Chicago's halls of power. It had seeped into the very agency sworn to protect her. The raid was set for the next morning, and Clara had to decide, warn the FBI, or stay silent and watch what happened. Because either way, someone wasn't coming out alive. The phone call replayed in Clara Ross's mind like a broken record. "Don't trust the raid. They know." A warning, an ambush, and a voice that seemed desperate, not threatening. As dawn broke over Chicago, the city still dusted with spring frost. Clara stood at her window, torn between two impossible choices. Tell the FBI and risk sounding paranoid, or stay silent and watch men walk blindly into a trap. Either way, she knew. What happened next could determine whether her husband's killers were truly exposed, or whether they would bury the truth forever. The FBI prepared for the raid with military precision. Dark sedans lined the bureau garage, shotguns and Tommy guns packed in the trunks. Agents checked their fedoras, tightened their trench coats, and briefed one another in clipped, efficient tones. Clara, seated in the corner of the bureau's Chicago field office, felt invisible. She wasn't supposed to be there, but the second ledger had made her indispensable, at least for now. One agent, a tall man with a scar near his temple, shot her a glance that lingered a little too long. Clara shivered. Something about him felt wrong, too watchful, too calculating. The warehouse sat along the Chicago River, where the water smelled of oil and sewage. Its rusting corrugated walls rose like a fortress against the skyline. the windows broken or blackened with grime. The air was thick with the stench of coal smoke from nearby factories. Inside, informants said, mobsters held their meetings. Politicians slipping in through the side door. Ledgers exchanged for envelopes stuffed with cash. It was supposed to be the place that proved everything Charles had died for. But Clara couldn't shake the phone call. Just before the raid began, Clara approached Special Agent Harris, the one in charge. "Someone tipped them off," she whispered. He frowned, but his jaw tightened. "Who told you that?" Clara hesitated. "A call. Last night. They said it was a setup." Harris studied her for a long moment. "Stay here. Don't move." But as he walked away, Clara saw him signal quietly to the scar-faced agent. Her stomach sank. The convoy rolled to the warehouse. Agents fanned out, weapons raised. But when the doors were kicked in, nothing. Just empty crates, dust, and the echo of footsteps. Not a single ledger, not a single man. It was a ghost scene, scrubbed clean. The phone call had been right. As the agents regrouped in frustration, shots cracked from the catwalks above. Muzzle flashes lit the rafters. Agents dove for cover. Clara, crouched behind a crate near the entrance, covered her ears as the warehouse erupted into chaos. In the confusion, Clara saw it. The scar-faced agent, the one who had eyed her earlier, wasn't firing upward at the ambushes. He was firing sideways, at his own men. For a split second, their eyes met across the smoke-filled room. His expression was cold, calculating, and certain. He wasn't surprised by the ambush. He was part of it. The raid had never been about gathering evidence. It was a purge. The corrupt wanted the Bureau's clean men eliminated. And Clara, holding Charles' second ledger, was the prize. She clutched the ledger to her chest, realizing that in this storm of bullets, she wasn't just a witness. She was the target. In the middle of the firefight, the scar-faced agent cornered Clara. Gun raised, his voice was calm, almost gentle. "You shouldn't have gone digging, Mrs. Ross. Charles learned too much, and now you've done the same." Her blood ran cold. He wasn't just another corrupt agent. He had been part of Charles' abduction all along. Charles hadn't been betrayed only by a business acquaintance. He had been betrayed by the very system sworn to protect him. The moment slowed to a heartbeat. Clara's back pressed to a steel beam, the sound of gunfire muffled in her ears. "Give me the ledger," the scar-faced agent said, "and maybe I let you walk out of here." Her hands shook, but her voice steadied. "You killed my husband. You'll have to kill me too." His eyes narrowed, finger tightening on the trigger, when suddenly, another FBI agent tackled him from the side. The gun skittered across the floor. Clara gasped as the two men wrestled, fists slamming against concrete. The warehouse rang with chaos. By nightfall, the Bureau declared the raid a success, though the truth was murkier. A handful of mobsters had been captured, but many more had slipped away. Several FBI agents lay wounded. And the scar-faced agent? Gone. He had vanished in the chaos, leaving only a trail of blood out the back door. The Bureau tried to reassure Clara. "We'll find him. Don't worry." But Clara wasn't reassured. She had seen his eyes. Cold. Certain. And she knew men like him didn't disappear. They hunted. That night, Clara returned home to find her front door ajar. She froze, heart pounding. Slowly, she stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of smoke and something else. Cologne. On the dining table sat a single greeting card. Plain white. No words on the outside. Inside, in sharp handwriting, was a single sentence. "The truth didn't die with Charles. Meet me tomorrow, alone." No signature, just a location scrawled beneath. Clara's hands trembled. Was it a trap? A warning? Or her one chance to finally uncover what Charles had truly died for? Either way, she knew. Walking into that meeting could change everything. The greeting card sat on Clara Ross's dining table like a ticking clock. The truth didn't die with Charles. Meet me tomorrow, alone. The handwriting was sharp, deliberate. No name, just a location scrawled beneath it. A derelict boarding house on the south side of Chicago. Clara knew it could be a trap. She also knew she couldn't ignore it. Because after everything, Charles' kidnapping, the ledger, the raid gone wrong. This felt like her last chance to learn why her husband had been killed. And whether she lived to tell the story was another question entirely. The next morning, Clara dressed in plain gray, slipping Charles' wedding band onto a chain around her neck. It was her shield, her reminder of why she was still fighting. The streets of Chicago were damp from an overnight rain. Cobblestones gleamed under the early sun, and the smell of wet coal drifted from factories. Clara's heart hammered as she approached the crumbling boarding house. Inside, the halls smelled of mildew and stale tobacco. Floorboards creaked under her steps. Every shadow felt alive. Then a voice whispered from the darkness, "Mrs. Ross, over here." In the back room, a man emerged. Thin, with deep-set eyes, his hands trembling as he lit a cigarette. He introduced himself as Thomas Grady, a former city clerk. Grady claimed he had worked with Charles months before his abduction. He had been the one who quietly slipped Charles certain records, ledgers of payoffs, lists of politicians on mob payrolls. He was going to blow the whole thing wide open, Grady said, smoke curling from his lips. But they got to him before he could. Clara's stomach sank. Charles had been right all along. Grady revealed that the conspiracy wasn't just local. Federal names in Charles' ledger weren't a mistake. They were real. Men in Washington had been taking mob money to look the other way. "You think it's just Chicago?" he asked bitterly. "This goes to the top." Grady explained the second ledger Charles left behind wasn't just a record. It was a map. Each coded entry pointed to locations where evidence was hidden. Documents, photos, witness accounts. Enough to bring down the entire machine. Before Clara could process it all, the door crashed open. The scar-faced agent stood there, revolver drawn, eyes burning with hatred. "End of the line, Clara. Hand it over." Grady's cigarette trembled between his fingers as the agent stepped inside. Clara clutched the ledger against her chest, suddenly recalling Charles' last words to her. "If something happens, look deeper." She realized he hadn't just meant the ledger. He meant courage. The courage to see past fear. Grady shoved Clara aside and lunged at the agent. A gunshot rang out, deafening in the small room. Grady crumpled, clutching his side. Clara screamed, pressing a hand to his wound. The agent advanced, smirking. "You think your husband was some kind of hero? He was a fool, and now you're going to join him." But in that moment, Clara noticed the window behind the agent, slightly ajar. She saw shadows moving outside. The FBI. The Bureau had been tracking Clara's movements. They had followed her to the boarding house. But this time, they weren't here to silence her. They were here to finally bring down their own traitor. Agents burst through the door. Gunfire erupted. The scar-faced agent spun, firing wildly, before collapsing against the wall, blood spreading across his coat. For the first time in months, the danger was over. Or so Clara thought. As medics rushed to Grady, the lead agent approached Clara. His tone was soft, almost fatherly. "You've done enough, Mrs. Ross. Give us the ledger. Let us handle it." But Clara hesitated. She had seen too much. Too many names. Too many cover-ups. Could she trust them? Her eyes narrowed. "No," she said firmly. "I'll keep it safe. I'll decide who gets to see it." The agent stared at her, then gave a slow nod. He understood. In that moment, Clara Ross wasn't just a widow anymore. She was a guardian of the truth. In the weeks that followed, fragments of Charles S. Ledger reached the press. Corrupt aldermen were indicted. A mob boss fled the city. The scar-faced agent's betrayal was splashed across front pages. But not every name was exposed. Some files Clara kept locked away. She had learned enough to know the world wasn't ready for all of it, and that some truths carried a price too high to pay at once. At Charles S. grave, she laid the ledger gently against the headstone before tucking it back into her bag. "You didn't die in vain," she whispered. "I'll carry this forward." The Charles Ross kidnapping had begun as a simple ransom case, but it ended as a story about power, corruption, and one woman's courage to fight for the truth. And in Clara's journey, we find lessons that stretch far beyond 1937 Chicago. The price of silence is often greater than the cost of speaking out. Trust is earned in actions, not titles. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. Justice isn't always immediate, but persistence can outlast corruption. Life is full of moments where fear tells us to stay quiet, but silence only protects the guilty. Like Clara, we are called to stand firm, even when the cost feels unbearable. And so the Charles Ross kidnapping came to an end, not with ransom paid, but with truth uncovered. A husband lost, but a legacy of courage gained. What about you? If you were Clara, would you have handed over the ledger to the FBI, or kept it, knowing some truths were too dangerous to release? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you would have acted in Clara's place. And if you found this story gripping, don't miss our next one. Another true crime tale of betrayal, courage, and the search for justice. Because sometimes, the darkest secrets lead us to the brightest truths.
The case may end here, but the questions don't. Don't let the trail fade into silence. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and turn on the notification bell so you're with us when the next story breaks. Because in the shadows of crime, the smallest clue can change everything. Stay vigilant. Stay curious. Stay with us. Behind the crime.